This is a conversation with Ramachandra Guha. He's a historian, writer, and scholar, popularly known for bestsellers like India After Gandhi, his biography of Mahatma Gandhi, and books on the history of cricket and environmental history. He's the winner of multiple awards, including the Padma Bhushan, and he's one of the most renowned historians on Indian history. Conversations like these are literally dreams come true. It's still a pinch me moment that I get to spend time with such brilliant minds and ask them all the questions that I've always wanted to ask them when I've read their work. It's a privilege and I don't take it lightly. And I really hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I enjoyed it. In this conversation, we talk about his journey becoming a writer, scholar, historian, what it takes to become good at this role. We talk about the rise and fall of the bilingual intellectuals in India, whether it's important to know a second or third language. We talk about Gandhianism, how it compares with Marxism or Leninism, whether non-violent methods are effective. We compare the Marxist idea of historical materialism with the great man theory in history. We also cover whether nation states can last, whether India will survive as a democracy, and whether democracy is an effective form of governance. And then we also cover the role of cricket in the evolution of Indian culture. And now, it's no time.
Check the mic and make sure it sound right, boys.
Mirza Ghalib once wrote, हुई मुद्दत की गालिब मर गया पर याद आता है वो हर एक बात पे कहना कि यूं होता तो क्या होता. You've often said that you became a historian, a writer, a scholar through a series of accidents. When you were growing up, you had a variety of career choices. Your father and grandfather were research scientists. You grew up in the Forest Research Institute in Dehradun. You've documented your uncle's efforts in trying to make you a cricketer in your book, Commonwealth of Cricket. Uski wajah se, when you went to college, you didn't take science because the practicals would have clashed with your cricket classes, took up economics. Grandfather didn't talk to you because of that. After economics, you then took sociology. And when you were researching the Chipko movement, at that point, you started discovering the power of history, the magic of it, the joy of discovering archives and then discovering the past through it. So let's start here. When you look back now in hindsight, out of all these different career choices, science, research, engineering, economics, sociology, and becoming a leg spinner, why do you think it was writing, scholarship, history that finally captivated your attention? What was so magical about these subjects?
It was just completely accidental, Shalas. So I knew exactly what I did not want to do. I had a great aversion to the corporate sector.
Yeah.
From very early on in my life, and this is pre-liberalization, and I think I may have carried it through even through liberalization. I just had a couple of cousins and an uncle in the corporate sector, and while I loved them as human beings, I found their obsessions and their concerns and their interests rather narrow and boring. I was interested in reading, but cricket was really my early obsession. And a small correction, I was an off spinner, not a leg spinner, which is a matter of some regret because I love watching leg break bowlers bowl. I mean, they've got much more art and skill. I mean, though it may be heretical to say so in the India of 2025.
All the comments start coming in.
I think Kumble was a much more interesting bowler than Ashwin. And Vaughan a much greater bowler than Nathan Lyon. So
Ashwin is watching.
I could not become a leg spinner, so I bowled off breaks. So it was, but fortunately, I grew up. I mean, you look at the first happy, you could say, circumstance or accident of my life. It was growing up before there was internet, before there was a smartphone, before even there was television, because Dehradun did not have television. In the 70s, it was only the big metros like Delhi and Bombay and Calcutta that had a few hours of state program television. So growing up without any distractions meant you listen to the radio. And the radio stokes your imagination in a way in which the internet or TV or videos cannot, because you're visualizing a scene. You know, the commentators telling you something about a landscape, about a stadium, about a crowd. And of course, books. I mean, to grow up where all you could do is read in print, whether they be magazines or books, stokes your imagination, your understanding, I think in a much deeper and more comprehensive way than, moving from site to site or, following 1 million people on Instagram or searching for 1 million followers on Instagram. So I think that was really the first accident because although I did not know I would be a scholar till I was in my early 20s or a writer, I think the love of reading, thinking, listening, observing. All those interests were cultivated in me by virtue of growing up in a world in which there were no gadgets. So you had to entertain yourself elsewhere. Also conversation. So, you have friends. And you're not constantly looking at your phone saying, मेरा message आया, क्या हुआ, क्या notification है, girlfriend से कुछ खबर है, nothing. And not even a phone. In fact, my parents got their first phone when I was about 15 or 16. Right? A landline, that too a landline. So friends walking, talking, conversing, listening, traveling, reading, observing. I think that was a great, in retrospect, the most fortunate thing about my upbringing and how that really helped me become a researcher who did everything for the long haul, not for instant gratification, quick attention, but knew somehow this upbringing instilled in me this unwittingly, unknowingly, instilled in me this sense that a career is not just a test match, but a series of 5 test matches, not a T20 match. So I think that is something which I suppose in retrospect I'm terribly grateful for. And my children, who are now 35 and 32, are the last generation to grow up without the smartphone. Because even when they were in school, they had television. They had access to some internet. But I think both of them are also readers and listeners because of when they grew up. I mean, I really worry for the kids of today and how they'll turn out.
I find it fascinating how these little things contribute in their own way towards, ultimately, if you're becoming a writer, this distinctive style that you create. You've said in the past that you believe a lifetime of listening to classical music has influenced your prose. You just mentioned when you grew up in Dehradun, there was no TV. You had to stoke your imagination a lot more. When you wrote your first few books, you wrote them by hand as well. And in previous interviews, you've tried to explore how all of these contribute towards your style, whether it adds some terroir to your writing. You spoke about being there for the long haul, whether it adds a rhythm or a cadence to your writing. What advice do you have for aspiring writers who always struggle in finding this fine line between creating a very unique, distinctive style when they write, but not letting that personality they've infused in the writing distract the reader from the content that you're trying to tell? Is there a way to find that fine line?
So, you see, obviously, any advice I give is provisional, has some boundaries and limits, because I don't write fiction, I don't write poetry, I don't write plays. There are even vast areas of history and non-fiction where I'm completely ignorant, like economics, technology, and so on. But I would say the broad piece of advice I would give is to any kind of writer or scholar or even scientist looking for a research problem, is follow your instinct, your heart, your mind, not what you think will get you fame or money or power. Don't look at what is cute, what is fashionable. Don't look for a space, an open space. I mean, a footballing centre forward needs to look for an open space, but not a writer. So be motivated, because that's when you give it your best, your fullest. If you are absolutely captivated by the problem or the issue or the question, you set yourself. That's the broad kind of macro advice I give. The micro advice I give, which is very, very simple to writers, is think of it, and this is where there's an analogy with classical music. So in Indian classical music, Carnatic and Hindustani, in Hindustani you use the word riyaz. So several hours every day. So you cannot say, I will write only when I'm in the mood, when I'm inspired. Every day you must put in the hard yards. And for me, I think I was oriented towards working almost every day and for several hours a day by being a cricketer and having to bowl 4 hours in the nets. So, and what specific time of the day you want to set aside for your writing is up to you. Some people write well after dinner, some early mornings, some during the day. But think of it as a consolidated block of at least several hours, during which you have disabled, WhatsApp and FaceTime and ideally even email from your computer. You do not have your phone with you. And you just focus on what you have to do that day. And the other piece of advice I give people, which younger writers are hesitant to adopt, is at the end of every day. Because you'll have some good days, some bad days. So there may be a day where you write 600 words. There may be a day where in a great rush of energy and inspiration, you write 3,000 words. Doesn't matter. When you finished your work for the day, when you know you will not write anymore, you may read or you may listen to music or you may watch a film. When you finish your day's work, print out whatever you've written. Because when you see it on paper, I think you're able to see the structure, the flow, and the faults of your narrative much better than on the screen, than scrolling down the screen. Some young writers have been slow to accept this advice, but they come around when I tell them, just print out everything. And then before you start the next day, you look over what you printed out or the accumulated stock of the last 5 or 6 days' work, and you know where you want to go next. So I think these are some rather rudimentary, elementary tips I gave. Now, obviously, if you don't have your phone, now in my case, my phone is not with me. But again, because I have children, parents worry, I have an elderly mother, every hour I'll check the phone. Right? That's okay. And if it's absolutely crucial and essential, attend to it. But it should be just you and your writing. Your writing, your thoughts, the screen on which you're composing. And it has to be, the focus and the concentration has to be absolutely total. Even if it's just 2 hours. Some people can't write, especially if you write fiction. It's hard to be, or poetry. You can't think of it. As a historian, it's just sort of straightforward narrative, putting together a narrative through all the research materials you've gathered, looking at your notes and then stitching it together. So in a sense, it's more mechanical work and less creative. I mean, there is an element of artifice in it, but not real art. So I don't think historians are artists. Historians are craftspeople. A great novelist is an artist. Of course, a great musician is a sublime artist. A poet is an artist. Some people who do more creative kinds of writing, such as fiction and poetry, cannot work. And some of this, but I think some of this, these broad guidelines would apply to them too.
Historians are not artists. I'm going to explore this.
Yes.
Even
I'm
further.
very clear about this. I mean, I have no illusions. So I know that a first-rate historian has his or her own worth and credibility and distinction and professional or vocational pride, because you want to do something well. You want to recreate some elements of the past in all its subtlety, its nuance, its richness, its complexity, its ambiguity, its contradictoriness, without letting your political or personal or ideological biases enter into it. So there's a craft to it. I believe that, but a great work of fiction is at another level, because you're imagining a whole world. You're visualizing a landscape you've not seen. You're peopling that landscape with individuals you don't know about, whom you've invented. Then you have to give them a character, a background, a family, a voice, a view. So when I read a really good novel, I know ki, as in Hindi they would say, mere bas ki nahi hai. Just as I couldn't control a leg break or a googly, I could bowl off breaks. That was about it. I can write a decent work of historical prose, but I could never write a really brilliant novel. I know that because I've also tried it. But as long as you have, I think some element of, I don't know what I should call it, modesty or self-awareness is very important for a historian, to know what you can do and what you cannot do. So, and that extends even to your own profession. So, as I said, I don't write fiction, but even when it comes to history, I'm a historian of the 19th and 20th centuries. If someone gives me a book on the Guptas and says write an endorsement for it, I'll tell them this is well beyond my domain. So I think some amount of self-awareness of what your gifts are, what your strengths are, and above all, what your limitations and limits are, is I think has to be cultivated.
I'm going to explore this further. By the way, small caveat, this is going to be, let's say, a masterclass into writing and scholarship historian. Assume I'm an aspiring student too, and I've come to you today just to pick your brains on every single thing I need to know to become good at this line of work. So we'll continue exploring how to become as good as you. Right from the outset, the first question that I have that's going to probably set the tone for all of my work is something similar to this. What is going to be my role as a historian or as a biographer, as a scholar? What function am I going to perform? You've said in the past that unlike men like Karl Marx or Vladimir Lenin or Mao or even Deendayal Upadhyay, who used to think that their role is similar to that of a philosopher who needs to change society or influence it, shape it, the role of a historian, in contrast, is to just study the world and interpret it. And this is a point of contention among many writers, because Some believe, yeah, you have to provide an objective, neutral account of what happened. Don't pass judgment on what happened. Just tell as it happened. And there are others who say, no, you have to infuse some amount of pedagogy in it, right? Because ultimately what we want to do is we want to learn from the mistakes of history, and then we shouldn't repeat it. We should not take regressive steps. We should always keep moving forward. What do you think? What is the role of a historian, of a biographer? Be objective, tell events as it is, or infuse some pedagogy in it?
No, I have a problem with the term objective. Because in the sciences, you can be objective. The scientist is completely detached from the object he or she is observing and experimenting on. Whereas a historian is also a human being. He has emotions, sentiments, ideas, prejudices, preferences, biases. And in your work, you should try and minimize those biases in how you write about the past. But you can never eliminate them. So what you write of the past cannot be dry and neutral. It has to be rigorously researched. It has to bring the past alive. But your narrative, because you're constructing words, a scientist works with numbers and equations largely. You're constructing words. You're constructing a narrative. You're constructing an argument. You will come into it. And so your views, your morals will be there somewhere. They should not be visible. They should not be too visible. They should not dictate what you write about. You should never willingly suppress a fact or a series of facts that are contrary to your political or moral beliefs. But so in that sense, you try to be as, I wouldn't say objective, as is a misleading word to use for history, as dispassionate as possible and as rigorous in your research, so that whatever you're researching, you examine as great a variety of sources that you can lay your hands on. Now, having said that, what I do believe something very strongly, which is that any writer of my kind who writes on issues of political, social, moral importance, who writes about injustice, inequality, democracy or the lack of it, pluralism or the lack of it, should resist the temptation to ever identify with a political party, and even more so to identify with a particular politician. Historians, in fact, not just historians, social scientists, so sociologists, economists, political scientists, and historians, there's a great temptation to be a Rajguru, to whisper in the ear of, the politician who's closest to your point of view. So if you are, shall we say, attracted to Hindutva, you want to find a BJP politician. If you're a secular liberal, you want to find a politician on the left. If you believe strongly that caste injustice is the most important question, you may want to talk to a politician from the Mandal parties. And, many political commentators and historians are vain. And writers are vain. Artists, people, successful professionals are vain, and particularly if they're men. Not exclusively if they're men. I've known vain, successful women too, but particularly if they're men, they have an inflated ego and exaggerated sense of the importance. And they're incredibly prone to flattery. So if you got a call, from, shall we say, a minister, education minister, it could be in Karnataka, it could be in Delhi, says, Dr. Guha, we like your writings. We really like your advice on what our curriculum should be, what our government policy should be. So, I'm having an impact. The chief minister is listening to me. The education minister is listening to me. And you think you're using them to get your views across. But actually, they're using you to give them legitimacy and credibility. So, I think one of the great advantages, because I'm principally a historian, but I'm also a columnist. So, I write a fortnightly column, which used to be a weekly column. The column is translated in 11 languages, so it appears everywhere across India, because I want to reach as wide an audience as possible. That's also one of the duties of the historian. But you shouldn't in your column, you're just communicating, interpreting, documenting. Very rarely are you advocating. And even if you're advocating, you should advocate in a broad sense. For example, something I've advocated in my writings, in a very broad sense, is about the virtues of pluralism. Why is it important that India, at its birth in 1947, no, actually the birth of the Republic is 1950 with the Constitution, Why was India constituted as a country in which no single religion or no single language would be dominant, and how that pluralism has sustained our unity and our democracy, and why abandoning it will be a problem. And to understand why abandoning this pluralism will be a problem, you only have to look westwards to Pakistan, which was constituted as an Islamic nation, but got divided because West Pakistan imposed Urdu on the Bengali speakers of East Pakistan, or look south to Sri Lanka, where the Sinhala majoritarians imposed their language on the Tamils of the north of the island. So these broad lessons you can, surely your work may throw up, but not specific pieces of advice that you want to communicate to a person in power. Right. And it's, as I said, writers, scholars, especially if they happen to be male, are vain and prone to flattery. So great, and I am sure I am too. I mean, I have my little petty and not so petty vanities as well. I have my ego. But a great advantage of being in Bangalore, far away from the center of power, is that these seductions come your way rarely.
Okay.
If I was in Delhi practicing my craft, I would want to become close to a politician, writing my books and my columns. I want to advise them. I would love it when some, foreign dignitary comes, the French Prime Minister comes, and as a well-known historian, the French ambassador calls me for dinner to meet the French Prime Minister. I think detachment from these kinds of inducements is, I think, very, very important, at least for me. And I advocate it to other people. So I think that's something which people find hard to understand, because they say, you have all these ideas, you have great ideas, put them into action. What is the concrete impact of your work? And why are you resisting this call from so-and-so to meet this so-and-so politician, so-and-so minister? I just stay away. And I think, I think that's because partly it's also not just a political or moral caution. Partly it's a aesthetic preference. I'd rather spend my time researching and writing than cohorting with politicians. That's also the case. So I've talked to some of them, and they're largely not interesting. Scientists are much more interesting, by the way. And one of the advantages of being in Bangalore is that you have the Institute of Science and the National Center for Biological Sciences and other places. And I, partly because I come from a family of scientists, partly because my early work in environmental history led me to collaborate with the scientists at IISc, the colleges there. I still enjoy their company very much.
Yeah, but rather than appeasing the politicians, I guess you could still pass judgment on some decisions that were made in the past. Let's say, for example, there was
Of course, yeah. Go ahead.
Like, for example, the emergency. It still looked at it with some ambiguous terms, a dark period in Indian history. But interestingly, when I've talked to some people around me, and I fully concede they might belong to the upper middle class or the middle class, a lot of them look back with some ambiguity, because they say, yeah, life was tough for the working class, but for the upper middle class, there was an improvement in quality of life because the government entities, they became more punctual, became more efficient, infrastructure was built quickly, roads were built, bridges were built. So at times, maybe it's okay, or at least even important, pass some judgment so that you actually drive the narrative.
But the judgment is passed through your writing and through making your writing accessible. So the way to, I believe that a historian has to make his work available and accessible beyond the academy, not just to his fellow scholars.
Right. You're not writing for scholars.
You're also writing for other scholars.
Okay.
Because you see, because history is not made up on the top of the head. It's a rigorous craft based on decades of research. So you want your work to meet the highest standards of scholarly attribution and credibility. So you are writing so that your fellow scholars don't say, "Arey, ye to amateur hai, ye to dabbler hai, ye to popular historian hai, ye kahan se aaya hai?" Because you have to have that depth of archival research. And every one of my books is based on years and years in the archives, uncovering primary sources, letters, documents, memoranda, reports, legal records that no one has seen before. So you have to address your scholars to convince them that the past you're reconstructing is something which is not made up on the top of your head, right? But at the same time, because history is not, unlike, shall we say, physics or mathematics. In physics, history is unlike physics and mathematics in that the subtlety, the complexity, the richness of the scholar's findings can be communicated in everyday language. So, history is a branch of scholarship and social science, and it's also a branch of literature. But it must be both. It can't be only literature, which is just telling anecdotes, because there has to be a structure, analysis. You have to use, the concepts of social science. But it's at the same time, you see a physicist or a mathematician solves a complex lemma. He or she can't communicate what that work means to you or me, but a historian can. So you have the obligation to communicate, which is why I try and ensure all my books appear in half a dozen or more languages. My column, as I said, is printed. It has to be written in such a way that the translator of my column into Urdu or Malayalam can do so seamlessly. And one or two, like Hindi, I can check. So my Hindi column appears in a major Hindi newspaper. First Hindustan, now it's in Amar Ujala. I can see that they can do it. A good translator can communicate my ideas in a language that is not my first language, or in some cases, not my language at all. So, say my column comes in Kannada. Now, I don't read Kannada, but I have friends who are well-known Kannada writers, and they read the column in Kannada and tell me that when they talk to me about it, I know they've completely got the essence of what I was arguing. So, in that sense, you must communicate to as wide an audience as possible. You must, but that is the historian's job as a citizen. But the fancy that you have some special knowledge that will lead to a better society, that you have some kind of a hotline to a person of power, or you should cultivate that is deeply problematic.
You brought up accessibility and language, so let's talk about it. What role does language play? You have written an essay, The Rise and Fall of the Bilingual Intellectual, in which you've lamented the decline of the linguidextrous individual. It's very hard to find writers today like Rabindranath Tagore, who used to write his fiction in Bangla and his polemical essays in English. And you've mentioned in a previous interview that one big regret of your life is that a lot of your intellectual discourse was in English because there's a class consciousness that's embedded in English. You witness kids get bullied at your boarding school if they couldn't speak English as well. So what role does language play? Is it just a tool, just a medium? Doesn't matter what story I'm telling. If I use any language, it will convey the same story.
No, a language is much more. Every language is a window to a new and different and distinctive world. So among the pieces of advice I give young historians is learn another language. You may know two. You may know your mother tongue in English, but learn a third. And my greatest regret professionally. In fact, more or less my only regret professionally. I mean, there are some books I would like to write, which I can't write because now my late 60s, I don't have the time. There are a couple of biographies I wanted to do where the subject's papers were not made accessible to me by the family. But those are trivial regrets. My only major regret is that when I was young, I did not learn, ideally, Tamil. It didn't have to be Tamil. It could have been Malayalam. It could even have been a non-Indian language. But every language is a window to a world. So my Hindi, for example, is good enough for research. I've given a few talks in Hindi, long talks. I can converse in Hindi, but I can't really write a full-fledged essay in Hindi. But if I read an essay in Hindi or I listen to a 1-hour lecture by, a scholar who's fluent in Hindi, I can appreciate the beauty, the nuance, the richness. For example, occasionally I gave an interview in Hindi. And because I grew up in Dehradun, I would speak a lot of Hindi. And my early research involved, reading Hindi newspapers and so on, my research on Uttarakhand. But now I hardly read Hindi and I speak only a little bit of Hindi here and there. So not long ago, I gave an interview in Hindi to a very fine young bilingual writer called Ashutosh Bhardwaj. And he said, "Aap Hindi mein kariye." To the interview one of my books. I said, okay. And so what I did was, before I went for the interview with Ashutosh, he's the Hindi editor of The Wire. He does these video.
This is the interview for the cooking of books, right?
Yeah. So before that, before I went, you heard that interview.
Yeah.
Before that, I said, look, let me spend an hour. So before I went to the Wire studio to meet Ashutosh, I just spent an hour listening. I just Googled and I looked possibly deliberately or by accident. I said, Hindi mein kya dekhu? Ashok Vajpayee, who's a very well-known Hindi poet, but also an IAS officer and very fluent in English. he was giving her a 1 hour interview. I just listened to it. So the language was in my head, beautiful. And Ashok Vajpayee speaks a beautiful Hindi with touches of Hindustani and Urdu. It is not formal and heavy Sanskrit. He is a wonderful communicator as a poet. So I listened to that. And because previously I had done an interview in Hindi on a political subject with somebody else about a year before. And when I heard the playback, I realized, shit, I'm stumbling. I'm using too many English words. So from that, I know that knowing more languages. Again, I have a friend whom, my closest foreign friend, I'll tell you a little bit about him. He is a great environmental historian and scholar who lives in Barcelona. His name is Joan Martinez Alier. And I met him, we've written a book together and several essays together. And he's a friend of now almost 40 years standing. Now, he was born in Franco, Spain. He comes from Barcelona, which is Catalan speaking. Because English is the language of international scholarship, he had to learn English and he did his PhD in Oxford. His first wife was German, so he learned German. He did research in Cuba, where his Spanish was adequate, but then he had to do research in Brazil, for which he learned Portuguese. Now, so he speaks half a dozen languages seamlessly. And he can make jokes in Spanish, Catalan, English, French, and German. So, and I look at what Joan has done in his life, and I say, that is an acute sense of regret I have. एक और कुछ जबान सीख लेता बस Tamil would have been fine in learning to read and write, because Tamil has a great classical tradition, poetic tradition, and my ancestors are from South India, but yet I hardly know any Tamil. So I think, which is why all young writers, I think, and they don't have to be historians, they can be novelists. They may want to be novelists who want to read Marquez in Spanish or Camus in French. So I think that is, so I would, to anyone listening to this podcast who doesn't have to be a writer, but just a curious thinking human being, while you're still young and alert enough and have a time, immerse himself in some language that is not your own. You will find it endlessly stimulating and enriching.
Yeah, language are these windows in the world, like you said. Even if it's the same story, we're not talking about translation, but if someone writes a story in English as compared to Hindi, it changes the tenor of the story entirely, right? I remember you'd shared a story where I think once a JNU professor told you that I sent your piece to my students and I told them, don't be confused by how well it's written. It's still saying important things.
Correct.
Yeah, language plays
That's the most curious compliment I've ever got. Yeah.
Okay, let's pivot into a brief history class. You have shared an interest in the past that you want to write a book about the 8 or 9 defining themes in Indian history. Since you have willingly volunteered for this, then I have to explore this. You are a researcher of Indian history of the 19th and 20th century, like you've said. What do you think are the 8 or 9 defining themes?
I don't want to write a book on 8 or 9 defining themes because I don't like lists. Who was the greatest batsman? Who was the greatest writer? Who was the most popular politician? I don't like that. What I would like to write, which I don't think I'll do, but I haven't planned, is to write, but before I tell you what I want to write, I have to go back to my training. I am known as a historian because my books are based on archival research. They follow a narrative arc. They're generally set in the past, not the very distant past, but not in the present. But I actually trained as a sociologist. And sociologists work with concepts much more than historians do. Historians work with evidence and narrative. And I would like to write a book, which I have actually prepared an outline of. And I'm putting it out in case, maybe I shouldn't put it out, but I will in case someone wants to steal the IP, on the major concepts and categories that define India. So there's religion, there's caste, religion and language.
You call it the axis of language, yeah.
So religion and language, there's caste, there's gender, there's tribe, there's region, like North versus South. I would like to write a book on all sociological concepts, and kind of each of them. And there's empire, because we were colonized by the British. What does that mean? What does empire mean to us? There's partition. What did that mean to us? So take 8, 9, 10 major concepts and explore There's minority rights. So flesh them out, flesh all of them out. There's now, of course, South versus North, which is now emerging. So a book that is more conceptual, that breaks down Indian history, not in terms of a chronological narrative, 1947 till today, which is what India after Gandhi does. So my biographical works do, but in a conceptual term. So concepts that are sociological, economic, geographical, cultural. So that's the kind of book I would like maybe one day to write, but I have too much on my plate at the moment.
Okay. Well, you keep me posted in case you ever get to it. Let's dive into some of your books on Indian history. Let's talk about Gandhi first. He's been the anchor point in many of your books. At times, he's the central figure, like in your biography of him. And at times, he's like the invisible hand that's like shaping the narrative. So let's pit Gandhi against another influential figure in world history, Karl Marx. You have said in an essay or in a book, An Anthropologist Among the Marxists, you've said inside every thinking Indian, there's both a Gandhian and a Marxist fighting for supremacy. You've studied both extensively when you were in Calcutta. A lot of your teachers were Marxists, but you've said they never let that seep into your classrooms. Having said that, most young historians at that point were told Marxism is the only way to understand history. So you got interested in that as well. And then when you were researching the Chipko movement, at that point, you started moving away from Marxism, started studying Gandhi because the founders of the Chipko movement, Sundarlal Bahuguna and Chandi Prasad Bhatt, both espoused Gandhian philosophy in life. So I want to flesh this out. What is Gandhianism? What is Marxism? What are the main tenets? And then is there an area of overlap? Can they coexist? Are they at conflict with each other? Why do you think they decide every Indian?
So, it's a very good question. One of the advantages, not one of the advantages, one of the attributes of a historian is to constantly rethink and revise. Anything you write is not the last word in history. It's not even the last word for yourself. So, An Anthropology of the Marxist was published 25 years ago. Today, I would say, rather than juxtapose Gandhi to Marx, one should juxtapose Gandhi to Lenin. Who was a Marxist? Who was the most influential Marxist ever? So, in a sense, you
are more of like the applied theory than the
exactly, precisely.
Applied physics. Yeah.
Precisely. So, I have a book coming out next year, which has a chapter on Gandhi versus Lenin, actually. So, I'll just take a bit. Okay, now you're right. So, Marx was a thinker. Marx wanted to change society, but he was never in a position to change society. Lenin created the post-revolutionary Russian state. Gandhi was instrumental, one of the people instrumental, arguably the most important person in creating independent India. Right. Now, they were born, these are very interesting parallels. Lenin was born just 6 months after Gandhi. So they are roughly exact contemporaries, whereas Marx was born, in 1818. So 50 years before Gandhi. Right? Then both Lenin and Gandhi belonged to a very large, very diverse, but country full of rich culture and language and music and heritage, but under oppressive autocratic rule. In our case, the British, in Lenin's case, in Russia's case, the Tsars, right? Monarchy. Now, both wanted to liberate their country not only from autocracy, but from backwardness. They both emphasized with the poor, the disadvantaged, the vulnerable. Both spent time in exile. Lenin was thrown out by the Tsar, and Gandhi went, of course, voluntarily. But when you're in exile, you can see your country in a clear light or a clearer light. And then you go back. Both came, and both effectively started their political careers at the same time. 1917 was the victory of the Russian Revolution, of the Bolsheviks. 1917 was Gandhi's first Satyagraha in Champaran. Right. So however, there are some incredible parallels, but there are some radical differences. The most important difference is, if you want to effect political change and social transformation, do you uphold the path of non-violence or do you uphold the path of violence? So this is a fundamental, and it still shapes global politics, you can say, right? Now, a second difference was, what is the role of religion? You suppress it completely, or do you allow it a space, but a space in which you can negotiate with other religions? Then, of course, there's a question of economic policy. Gandhi's was grounded in the village. Lenin believed in centralization, industrialization. Then there's also issue of language and expression. Gandhi was non-violent in his political beliefs, but also in his language. The way he was always courteous and civil with his opponents, whereas Lenin was vicious and abusive. As a proponent of violence through armed struggle, he was also vicious and abusive in his personal polemics. In fact, I've said in the past that Lenin would have been a super troll in the age of X and Twitter. Okay. Now, but both had transformative impacts. Without Lenin, you would not have the Russian Revolution. Without the Russian Revolution, you would not have the Chinese Revolution, or the Vietnamese Revolution, or the Cuban Revolution. Gandhi transformed India, but also South Africa, also America through the civil rights movement, also Eastern Europe through his influence on solidarity and so on and so forth. So these are the two great. So that's where I would amend that argument, not rejected but amended, because Lenin's intellectual apparatus is still coming from Marx. Except that, unlike Marx, he had the opportunity to put his ideas into political practice and was an almost exact contemporary of Gandhi. And also, like Gandhi, lived in a very large, very complex country which had a very oppressive political system, which Lenin and Gandhi in each case wanted to transform. So I think that is, and obviously my preference is somewhat towards Gandhi. But I can see why people are attracted to Lenin, because it promises quicker, more radical, more complete, more comprehensive transformation. Proper liberation. But Gandhi's part is slow, as he used to say, one step at a time, incrementalism. So that is really the great debate of the 20th century, which echoes the great ideological and political debate of the 20th century, is really Gandhi versus Lenin, which kind of to some extent continues on to the 21st. Not totally, because now there are new things that have come, like religious fundamentalism, which both opposed, of course, populism and so on.
Interesting amendment. Your first mentor had said that all works of history are interim. Mark Bloch had said that ultimately every work of history needs to be superseded by a newer work. So I completely agree with you. Let's dive into one of these contradictions that exist between Gandhi and Lenin now. You brought up non-violence, the founding pillar of Gandhianism. And you're right, this is a serious point of contention every time there is a struggle for independence, autonomy, self-determination. Are non-violent methods sufficient, or is violence a critical component of a struggle? You brought up all these different examples in American history. There is a question mark over the civil rights movement, whether just Martin Luther King's methods, which he was a big fan of Gandhi, were enough, or whether the government's hand was forced by the aggressive tactics by the Black Power movement, the Black Panther Party, Nation of Islam, or Malcolm X. In South Africa, Nelson Mandela himself conceded that after the Sharpeville massacre, that non-violent methods are not going to be sufficient. His own wife, Winnie Mandela, was involved in a lot of violent demonstrations. They put the tires around people and burn them alive. In Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah spoke about violence. Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso. Fidel Castro, one of the big proponents of violence, said that history will absolve me, because we were taught that liberty is not begged for, but is won with the blade of a machete. And in Indian history, there are similar question marks over whether we would have achieved independence at the time we achieved it, if not for the aggressive tactics employed by, let's say, Bhagat Singh or Chandrasekhar Azad or Subhash Chandra Bose or the Indian National Army. If it was just left to Gandhi and his methods, would it have prolonged the Raj? Would the British have time to regroup after World War II, which was a critical period where they were vulnerable? And there are similar questions whether if someone more aggressive was at the helm, would the partition have happened at all? Do you think non-violence is enough and can be sufficient for these movements, or is violence an equally important part?
So, Shalaj, all these questions have been tackled in my next book, so I won't talk about them. I have raised the question of Bose and Bhagat Singh versus Gandhi, and I've patiently tried to show what could or would have happened, Lenin versus Gandhi. But I'll just talk about one thing. I'll just say two things. Wherever a country has won its independence through violence, it has been run as an authoritarian, anti-democratic state. That is one universal rule. Okay. Post-war, there have been many transitions to democracy. 90% of them have come through non-violent struggles. But more importantly, South Africa is a fascinating case. In South Africa, the African National Congress was founded in 1912. And it was modeled on the Natal Indian Congress, which Gandhi founded. And for 50 years, almost 50 years, they practiced non-violence. And then after the Sharpeville massacre, they gave it up. Now, even when they gave up non-violence, they they were very restrained in their use of violence. So they never attacked civilian targets. So unlike, shall we say, the Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka or the Kashmiri jihadis, they never attacked civilian targets. They only attacked government installations. Then, to minimize the use of force, it was just to intimidate, a little bit to intimidate the apartheid regime to loosening up. Then, when apartheid fell, Mandela behaved very differently from Lenin and Mao and Castro and others. When Lenin and Mao and Castro achieved victory, political victory, through violence, their first act was to crush all dissent, which meant not just of ordinary people, but particularly persecute their erstwhile political rivals. The Gulag is well known, but Castro put all his critics into jail and treated them in the most despicable, inhuman way. Mao murdered so many of his opponents. Mandela reached out to the whites and said, together we'll build a society. And there he was learning from Gandhi, like Gandhi reached out to English. But all these issues have been, as I said in my next book, which is about Gandhi and his critics, and not just critics on the question of violence, but critics on his economic policy, on his attitudes towards caste. So there's a full chapter on Gandhi and Ambedkar. All that has been, I won't reveal too much in this interview because I've written a whole book on it, of 400 pages, which will be out in a few months, and I urge your listeners to buy it and see what it argues.
Well, now that you build the suspense, now
see what it argues.
I'll wait for the book. But you brought up something interesting. Let's talk about this sword of inevitability that I think hangs over history. I find it very fascinating. In German history, there's the Sonderweg theory, the special path, that implies that the rise of Nazi Germany or the Third Reich or Hitler was a consequence. It was an inevitability because of the path that Germany was on after World War I, because of the political instability, the economic hardship, the Treaty of Versailles, failures of the Weimar Republic, leaving the country more vulnerable to authoritarianism and nationalism. So if not Hitler, then someone just like him would have risen to power. He was not a bug of the system. He was a feature of it. That's where, I guess, the forces of nature were heading. This is a very Marxist view of history, right? Historical materialism. That it's not one person or one event that influences history. It's the forces of nature. And similarly in other countries as well, where you see a rise in authoritarianism or nationalism, if you study the rise of Donald Trump or Modi, just to say that they came out of the blue is to ignore the context that caused their rise to power, right? So how do you view this sort of inevitability? Is history shaped by just great men and great events, is like the great man theory put forward by Thomas Carlyle, or as disputed by Plekhanov in his essay, The Role of the Individual in History? No, it's not one person or one individual. They're just byproducts of larger movements that shape history.
It's both. Obviously, it's both. And a good historian investigates both. Both the larger structural forces that shape a society in a certain way and the critical intervention for good and for bad. There's Gandhi and there's Hitler. The critical intervention for good and for bad by particular individuals who have the power to shape the course. So it's both. But on this question of the long historical forces, let me answer, though I'm something you raised in your earlier question about partition. Was partition inevitable? Now, if you look at the debate today, it's highly polarized. Nehru, Gandhi could have stopped partition, Nehru could have stopped partition, Patel could have stopped partition, etc., etc. Jinnah was greedy and wanted partition. Right. Now, and this whole debate about why partition happened, could it have been prevented, is all focused on the period 1946-1947. That's it. Right. But actually, the origins of partition lie in the first decade of the 20th century, long before Gandhi and Nehru and Patel entered and Jinnah entered politics. In 1906, so just to give you a sense of how these deeper historical forces influence something like partition, I'll give you a slightly long answer but partition is something which Indians and Pakistanis are obsessed with and keep on endlessly debating, and there are many simplistic, superficial theories offered about it. Right. Now, in 1857, there was this major rebellion against the British. Right. Now, that also is, the British called it a mutiny. Savarkar called it the first war of Indian independence. It was more than a mutiny and less than a war of independence. It was a great rebellion. But after that great rebellion, the British imperial state took over the reins of authority from the East India Company, and we formally became a colony of the British Crown. And Queen Victoria became an emperor, and then there was a rather elaborate state structure erected. Now, and in 1857, this is something interesting which I don't think very few of your listeners will have grasped the significance of this. They all know of 1857 because it was the year of the Great Rebellion that was crushed eventually by the East India Company. But 1857 was also the year that the first modern universities came to India. So Calcutta, Bombay and Madras were the first modern universities were established in 1857. The Great Rebellion was looking backwards to the Mughal Raj, to the Mughal Empire, to the resurrection and the recreation of the Mughal Empire. The universities of 1857 were looking forward to transforming society. And ideas of freedom and justice and equality came inadvertently there because the British wanted modern education to train babus for their civil service. But by now, Britain had become a democracy, and liberal thinkers were arguing for rights for women and equality and so on. All that came to the universities. And through the second half of the 19th century, Hindus took much more to modern education than the Muslims. Some Muslims did. I mean, Sayyid Ahmad Khan, who was a great Muslim reformer, warned the Muslims not to wallow in nostalgia for the Mughal Empire, as the leaders of 1857 were doing. Remember, in 1857, Bahadur Shah Zafar, the last Mughal, was held up as the great ruler of India. He said, don't wallow in nostalgia. And he started the Aligarh Muslim University. But most Muslims were wallowing in nostalgia. And from 1857 to 1900, Hindus took a dramatic lead over Muslims in modern education, access to modern jobs. There were many more Hindu lawyers, professors, doctors, civil servants, industrialists, and so on and so forth, right? Because modern industry was also starting. So in 1906, sensing this asymmetry, a group of Muslim nobles and aristocrats started the Muslim League. And they appealed to the British, because the British had now started conceding some limited representation in councils. So there were town councils, legislative councils, where the British were still ruling, but Indians had some kind of voice. They said in these local small-scale elections, for which educated Indians could vote and become elected as members, in this, there should be a separate electorate for Muslims. And the British conceded their demand, partly because they wanted to divide Hindus and Muslims. Because 1905 is also the year, 1905 is the year, 1905, 1906 are the years of the Swadeshi movement and the vigorous upsurge of the Congress. So that's what happened. So the creation of separate electorates, the formation of the Muslim League in 1906, and the creation of separate electorates, where Muslims vote for Muslims and Muslims represent Muslims, sows the seed of partition. Because the Hindus are also want to organize politically. So from 1906, partition becomes likely. Not inevitable, but likely. In 1937, elections are held for the first limited self-government comes in 1937, when under the Government of India Act of 1935, which is a result of the nationalist pressure of the Congress and so on, you have elections in 9 provinces. The Congress comes to power in 7. In 1946, after the war, elections are held again, and the Muslim League sweeps the Muslim seats. So now a Muslim nation becomes inevitable because there's a groundswell of intellectual Muslim opinion behind Jinnah. So the only question is, how will partition occur? Slowly, incrementally, with safeguards in place to minimize violence. But by 1946 and arguably by 1937 and possibly even by 1930 and perhaps even by 1909 when you have separate electorates, the seeds of partition are sown. So these are these deeper structural forces where, as a consequence of what happens after the 1857 rebellion, Muslims fall behind in education and employment, and there's a move to give them separate representation, and that really leads to politics being conducted on religious lines. So in a sense, this is how, and of course, it's possible that if in 1937, when 38, when Jinnah and Gandhi had talks, if these two individuals had worked out a compact, maybe it could have been averted. We don't know, right? But this whole story of the long routes of partition shows the complex interaction between deeper historical forces and individual the trajectories and whims and fancies and preferences of individuals. And so both are important. I mean, I think the Marxists, the idea that individuals don't matter, even the Marxists rejected in the case of Marx, Engels, and Lenin. They think I think those three.
Yeah,
I mean, which they did, of course. Which they did. So I think it's the interplay between institutions and individuals, between what historians call structure and agency, that varies across different, So even in the case of Gandhi, to go back to Gandhi. Now, you can see if Gandhi comes back to India in 1915, January. In February, his mentor Gokhale dies. If Gokhale had stayed alive, Gokhale was a nationalist, but a liberal Democrat who opposed Satyagraha. He would have told Gandhi, don't do Satyagraha.
Right.
But Gokhale is dead in 1915. In 1919, Gandhi launches his first Satyagraha, major All India Satyagraha, against the Rowlatt Act. While he is launching it, the most popular militant nationalist leader, Bal Gangadhar Tilak, is away in England fighting a court case. So Gandhi emerges as the leader, Tilak comes back and dies. So the space is wholly Gandhi's. So clearly, the death, the arrival of individuals, of accidental circumstances shape what happens. But the larger forces do too. And a good historian, in their account of what had happened in the past, would really adjust for both, properly adjust for both.
There's a similar one that you point out in your book is the early death of Sardar Patel, and that ultimately allowed Nehru to consolidate power. Otherwise, there was two positions of power within the Congress itself. How do you view the permanence of nation states? I had interviewed Jeffrey Sachs on the show earlier this year, and he had said there is, purely from a game theory lens, there is no sub-game perfect Nash equilibrium where we just live in this world where we have nation states defined on these arbitrary boundaries and every nation just looking out for itself. And somehow we're just going to solve all these global issues of, let's say, the environment, climate change, diseases, hunger, AI ethics, if every nation is looking out for itself. In India after Gandhi as well, you constantly marvel at how India's just managed to survive as a country. And this goes back all the way back to when Mirza Ghalib, who used to despair about the future of the country. But many people forget that the structure that we take for granted, even for people around us, there are people who have seen a world in which India and Pakistan didn't exist as a country. The Middle East didn't exist. Bangladesh didn't exist. All of these countries that you now take for granted. Do you think this setup of nation states with these random boundaries and the problems it creates, is that sustainable, or at some point we have to now start evolving to a global world order to solve these issues?
So, Shalaj, a historian should not be a Rajguru. And a historian is definitely not a Jyotish. So you could use your knowledge of the past to illuminate the present, but no further. Absolutely no further. So I can't say at the moment, many people predicted the nation state will wither, will weaken, but actually boundaries have been consolidated. But there is one reason why I not believe in the nation state, but why I regard citizenship of a nation state as important, even for a critic of the policies of the nation state. And this is, I'll have to invoke the first edition of India after Gandhi, where in the epilogue, I quote a Scottish scientist, J.B.S. Haldane, who became an Indian national. And he was the world's great biologist, 2 or 3 greatest biologists since Darwin. And after he became an Indian citizen in 1957, there was a profile of him in the Scientific American, where an American writer called him a citizen of the world. And Haldane wrote to this, and this writer meant it as a compliment. You are a citizen of the world, not just of India. And Haldane replied, said, I am not a citizen of the world because to be a citizen of the world implies a world state. And one of the first chief duties of a citizen is to hold his state to account for the crimes it commits. I can hold the state of India to account, but how can I be a world citizen when there is no world state? So I believe that, which is why I see myself as a citizen of India. not a jingoistic citizen of India, not a citizen of India who supports his government at all times, but a citizen of India who tries to call his government and his people recall their best values, as embodied in the Constitution, as embodied in the legacies of Gandhi and Ambedkar and Tagore and Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay and Nehru and Patel and so on. So I don't think nation states are going anywhere. That does not mean we should not make every nation state more democratic and tolerant within, and more open to collaboration and cooperation without, on questions of AI, dangers of AI, climate change, etc., drugs, etc. So that, and why maybe a renewal of the United Nations is extremely important. If there's a recommendation I would like to make, it would be to reconstitute the Security Council so that France and England are removed as permanent members, and maybe Brazil, South Africa, and India become permanent members, along with the USA and China and Russia, to truly represent 6 different parts of the world, 6 different people of the world. So, and that would be the way in which we can achieve what some of maybe Jeffrey Sachs wants, rather than wishfully and naively and hope for the dismantling of nations. They won't go away.
If I can play devil's advocate, one of the reasons why I'm not optimistic about this setup is because I think it puts an artificial ceiling on what you care about. The Princeton philosopher Peter Singer had written a book, The Expanding Circle, in which he said every person has a system of concentric circles about what you care about. You start by caring for yourself, then you care for your family, then your tribe, then community, then the country, then beyond that, all of humanity, and then maybe even animals. And
by the way, Gandhi has a very similar concept called the oceanic circle. And I wonder whether Singer had heard of it or was influenced by it. In 1946, Gandhi talked about these oceanic circles.
Maybe it is inspired by that. And what I feel is nation states, because they prioritize national interest, national security, national pride, they put the ceiling at the national level, stop you thinking about humanity. So do what's good for the country, even if it comes at the cost of other countries. And we can walk through this with a specific example. If we think about humanity as a whole and not national pride, would that make the Kashmir question easier to solve? I think it might.
Yeah, but the Kashmir question has a very simple solution. And the solution is, the reason it's not, the solution has not been concretized is aggressive national pride on both parties and competitive politics in both countries and competitive politics in both countries. So the solution for Kashmir has 2 steps. A permanent solution for Kashmir is first, the line of control should become the international boundary. So what the part of Kashmir that is now with Pakistan remains with them, the part of Kashmir that is now part of India remains with us, geographically. So the line of control becomes international boundary. And each country resolves that in the part of Kashmir that belongs to it, the residents of that part are given dignity, respect, autonomy, freedom, employment, etc., right? And not treated as a kind of colony, which in both, India has treated Indian Kashmir as a colony, Pakistan treated Pakistan Kashmir as a colony. That's true from 1947, not merely from 2019. Now, why has this not happened? Because of competitive politics. And that is not to do, you don't have to be, believe in some kind of global vision. It's because when Vajpayee promoted peace with Pakistan, the Congress opposed it. When Sonia Gandhi, when Manmohan Singh promoted peace with Pakistan, the BJP opposed it. So it is that the opposition party, the Congress between 1999 and 2004 and the BJP after 2004, did not recognize that the national interest as well as the global interest was served by honorable compromise over Kashmir. Right. So I don't think you have to be a world citizen to recognize that Kashmir is solvable within the existing parameters of what India is and what Pakistan is.
Yeah, I guess the problem is as long as you have a nation, you'll have this national pride. Like, who's ready to give up? Like, there's currently a sense of loss if you even agree to the line of control, right? Which is a manufactured sentiment.
It has to be a brave statesman who's able to persuade everyone that this is a fake sense of loss. It's actually gain. Because if there is peace, proper peace, we reduce our defense budget, Pakistan reduces defense budget. We increase our health and education budget, they increase the health and education budget. So it's in the best interest of citizens of both countries, right? So it has to be someone of that kind of sagacity and wisdom. Manmohan Singh had it, but lacked the capacity of articulation. He had the ideas, but not the charisma to convince people. Modi has the charisma, but lacks the vision and the ideas. So maybe someone will come who will have both. And then we can actually do this because it's in our national interest to spend more money on education and health and less on defense. And it's even more in Pakistan's national interest. So today, when Field Marshal Munir says this is a jihad and we will reclaim the valley, he's acting against the national interest of Pakistan. And when the leading BJP politicians, including Rajnath Singh, who's otherwise one of the most sober members of this cabinet, says, we have to liberate Pakistan-occupied Kashmir, he is going against the true national interest of India. So I think that should be, once this very straightforward case is made palatable and you are able to persuade people of it, you can have peace in Kashmir. And to the immeasurable benefit of the citizens of India and Pakistan.
There's a broader question here about the democratic setup, but I'll park that aside because I want to close the loop on the nation-state question. You mentioned the role is not of a Jyotish, not looking forward. So let's look back at the past and just run a digression, maybe a small case study about India. You brought up the first edition of India after Gandhi. You had also quoted Isaiah Berlin there, who had said the infliction of a wound on the collective feelings of a society, or at least of its spiritual leaders, is a necessary condition for the birth of a nation, for the birth of a nationalist sentiment. For this sentiment to transform itself into a political movement, however, required one more condition, namely that the society in question must, in the minds of at least some of its most sensitive members, carry an image of itself as a nation, at least in embryo, in virtue of some general unifying factor or factors, language, ethnic origin, or a common history. And you've pointed out in the book, India has none of these unifying factors, no common language, history, ethnicity, or religion. And then Sir John Strachey had also said, there is not and never was an India, any country possessing any sort of unity, physical, political, social, or religious. And he likened the probability of India surviving to that of a single European nation. So he thought it was a ridiculous idea. Winston Churchill agreed with him. Rudyard Kipling agreed with him. So why do you think India has survived? Is it just luck or jugaad, or is there method to the madness?
It survived because of the constitutional values laid down by founding figures. After India after Gandhi, in 10 years after India after Gandhi, I gave a lecture in memory of Justice Suranda Bhandare, which I entitled Patriotism versus Jingoism. And I said there are two varieties of nationalism. And India chose the path of patriotism to found our nation on a system of values. What are the values? An end to caste and gender discrimination, the promotion of linguistic and religious diversity, the promotion of individual freedoms, and the promotion of economic policies to end poverty and suffering. We may not have succeeded in all of this, or in much of it, but it was founded on values. Jingoism is founded on identities. What defines India? India is Hindu. Indians speak Hindi. Now that is how Pakistan defined itself. What defines Pakistan? Pakistanis are Muslims and Pakistanis speak Islam, and Pakistan has a common enemy, India, which is why now, and so here Hindutva is the ideology of Pakistan in reverse. It is Jingoism. And I think India was an extraordinary experiment. And that largely comes from Gandhi. I mean, Gandhi, because of his years in the diaspora, understood that India did not belong to Hindus, because his first clients were Muslims. His first supporters in the Satyagraha were Parsis. When he was almost killed, he was restored back to health by a Christian couple. He recognized, and he also saw Tamils who played a very important role in his movement. And of course, Gandhi was deeply aware of what disfigured Indian society, the awful treatment of Dalits and of women. So that is what lay behind this unique Indian experiment. That was founded on a system of values, egalitarian and inclusive values, not on identities, not on pride or your religion or your language or your alleged antiquity of your civilization and so on and so forth. And that model of a constitutional patriotism is now under threat by an aggressive nationalism, which I call Jingoism, which is very much like what Pakistan did and Russia did and or does and Turkey does and America does and so on. America is facing the same crisis.
So ethno-nationalism seems like a trend line, no? It feels like
It
all
is.
nation states are ultimately heading in that
No,
direction.
they may go back. And there are reversals too. There are reversals too. It's not as if you have to go that way. I mean, Brazil rejected Bolsonaro and has now gone for Lula, who's a very different kind of person. So I think right now, of course, what you want to call ethno-nationalism or what I call jingoism is in the ascendant. But I think the uniqueness of India was where how its founders recognized that it was values and not identities that constituted what it meant to be an Indian. And we have to recover and remember that and restore that. That's where the historian that is the lesson from history that I would seek to draw.
This naturally leads into the question that I had parked aside, so we can explore it now, which is about the political setup and whether democracy itself creates these trend lines or these patterns. You have explored a lot of these trend lines in your essays, in your book. I'll just point out 3 to add to the ones you've already pointed out. One, there's always a reversal to the mean towards populism. You've covered how Indira Gandhi, who had no political ambition, very quickly started resorting to populism. You said that if Lal Bahadur Shastri had completed his term, Indira Gandhi wouldn't have made it into politics itself. Rajiv Gandhi would have been a pilot. Rahul Gandhi would have been a mid-level manager in some corporation. Her son, Rajiv Gandhi himself, had no political ambitions, got into politics, very quickly started resorting to populism, like in the Shah Bano case. Another trend line that emerges is India's tendency to gravitate towards a cult of personality. You've made the case that people voted for Nehru over the Congress or Indira over the Congress, and arguably people vote for Modi now over the BJP. And another trend line or pattern that emerges is most political parties seem to reach an equilibrium state where they become family firms, right? So Congress has become a family firm, Shiv Sena, DMK, Akali Dal. None of these are comforting as a citizen. And it's not just happening in India, it's happening in most democracies across the world. So it raises the question whether the target state, which is democracy, is in itself skewed in some way, because it's, as long as this exists, there will be politicians who want to garner power, keep it within themselves, appease the masses, right, manipulate the media. So do you think we have to rethink the democratic structure as well?
I think we have to rethink democracy, but not the democratic structure or the democratic way of life. In fact, I'm not a great fan of Winston Churchill, but one of his statements, I think, which still rings true is to the effect that democracy is the worst form of government except for all your other side. So I think, more transparency, reform of the electoral system in India, moving not towards proportional representation, because that would require a new constitution, but a system in which has been proposed by the Association of Democratic Reforms, where in every constituency, the winning candidate has to win more than 50% of the vote. So shall we say this constituency where we are speaking is called Shivaji Nagar. Okay. Now in Karnataka, there are 3 major parties, and sometimes all 3 put up candidates: the Congress, the JDS, and the BJP. And usually with 35-40% of the vote, you can win. But if you have to get 50% plus 1, and if you don't, there's a runoff between number 1 and number 2, which can easily be done today with the sophisticated voting systems we have. So there may be some kind of then cross ownership of in media are not allowed, so that the Adanis and the Ambanis can't own media channels because they own everything else in so many other sectors. So there are ways in which we can have a less malfunctioning democracy. Personality cults and family firms are maybe more difficult to eradicate, because they are linked to how Indian society has organized itself over centuries, and maybe millennia. Though obviously social media heightens it. Trump, not just in India, Trump is a creation of social media. Boris Johnson was a creation of social media. And it's difficult to see outstanding but uncharismatic politician like Angela Merkel becoming as successful as she was any time in the near future. But I think, authoritarianism will not work in a country as large as ours. It's worked in China, but at a horrific cost. But we are so large, we're so diverse. I think more decentralization, so away from Delhi to the states, and power and authority and responsibility and financial accountability away from Delhi to the states, and from the states to villages and panchayats and municipalities. I mean, these are all ways in which I think thinkers more qualified than me. People who think about institutional reform in a much more systematic and informed way than I do as a historian. I think they have written about these things. But the idea that, today what we're seeing, I've said, I'm not very, I read long books, as you know. India After Gandhi is 900 pages. My 2-volume biography Gandhi is 2,000 pages. I read long books. And I'm not very good at sound bites. But one of the remarks I'm proud of, because I made it several years ago, and it's turned out to be unerringly accurate, was when I said Narendra Modi is Indira Gandhi on steroids. That's what. So I think the centralization of power in an individual, in a party, and in the central government, that I think is terribly dangerous. And of course, the pandemic hastened that. Indira Gandhi needed an emergency to do it. Here, without the emergency, because of the pandemic, we could slowly shift power away from the states. And the states need to decentralize too, There's too much power in the secretariat here in Karnataka and not enough in the districts or in the towns. So I think these are ways in which democracy can be configured differently. But you can't have an authoritarian. It would not. America is being damaged by Trump. The greatness of America is so undermined by ceding so much power and authority to one person. Look at what he's done to the institutions, to the courts, to the military, to the and above all to the universities. That as in America, democracy and pluralism and diversity are our strengths.
Yeah. No, I'm definitely not making a case of authoritarianism. And you're right, people more qualified than me have to probably come up with a more democratic setup. There are interesting ideas out there. There's something called a network state as well. But I guess your book clearly illuminates this whole idea of just trying to go for the lesser evil. Something about it is not comforting as a citizen. You were born in Nehru's India, and you've lived through the term of every prime minister India has had to date. Right. Clearly, you're not a fan of Modi. Clearly, you're not a fan of Indira Gandhi. Was there ever a period where we came close to what was called the golden era in Indian history?
So there's no golden era. I think Nehru's charisma was absolutely vital to keeping India together.
At that point, yeah.
Nowadays there's this great and mischievous desire to set Nehru against Patel. We needed both. Patel united India territorially and administratively. Nehru united India emotionally and culturally. So that charisma was important then. Though arguably Nehru stayed on too long, he should have left in 1958 and so on. But if you look at post-Nehruvian prime ministers, the best prime ministers have been the uncharismatic people. Shastri, Narasimha Rao, Manmohan, and even Vajpayee was not totally uncharismatic. He was not like Narasimha Rao, but he was not, a larger-than-life figure. So I think, the idea that one person, one visionary great leader can transform a company, a cricket team, shall we say a newspaper, one great editor, even a small city-state like Singapore, but not a country like ours. The idea, and somehow we all want to lay, as Ambedkar said famously in the Constitutional Assembly, that we should not lay down our liberties at the feet of a political leader, however great a person that leader might be. And but the personality cult, of course, is now there in the states too. There's a cult of Mamata Banerjee. There's a cult of Stalin. There was a cult of Kejriwal.
Jayalalitha.
There's a cult of Jayalalitha. I'm talking about not people dead, alive. Vijayan is promoting a cult of himself in Kerala, even though the CPM was even more antipathetic to cults than the BJP. Right. So I think this is something. Maybe, it's also... But the Supreme Court has passed one very unwise judgment, which people have not given enough attention to. There was a case before the Supreme Court arguing that government advertisements should not have the picture of the Chief Minister or the Prime Minister. In Canada, for example, it's not allowed. So if, say, Mark Carney puts out an ad saying, tax reduced by 10%, he can't put his mugshot. He can say the Canadian government announces welfare means for its citizens, tax rates are down from 50% to 40%. But Supreme Court foolishly not recognizing Ambedkar's very wise warning. So, it's at the cost, apart from the cost, for example, in Karnataka, or if a government falls and a new chief minister comes, the next day every bus is repainted with the face of the. I mean, it's idiotic. But this is where the Supreme Court completely played into, acted in sort of the Supreme Court facilitated the anti-democratic instincts of Indian culture, which glorifies gods and goddesses and politicians who pretend to be gods. So I think that was so. Modi's mugshot is everywhere, but in Bengal, Mamta's mugshot is everywhere. That's not healthy. That's not at all healthy. Personality cults are bad. Personality cults in any sphere of life are bad.
What happens in these positions of power? Because at times when these individuals were rising, you brought up Kejriwal, Modi, there was a case to be made about their intent and what they came across. In the Gulag archipelago, Alexander Solzhenitsyn had said, the line separating good and evil passes not through states, nor between classes, nor between political parties either, but right through every human heart. There's another saying, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts, absolutely. Is it the positions of power that ends up distorting these men? And that would explain why even someone as great as Gandhi started developing these warped ideas of celibacy and, and sleeping with his granddaughters.
So I think, absolutely. I think what you need is a feedback loop. You need people close to you who can criticize you. Nehru had Patel and Rajaji. Then Patel died and Rajaji went far away to Madras and then, of course, started his own party. Gandhi had a feedback loop. I mean, and it was composed of Mahathir Desai, secretary, C.F. Andrews, Rabindranath Tagore, and a couple of others. Kasturba, his wife, all of them died in the 40s. And when this crazy megalomaniac experiments with celibacy, where he started thinking he alone can save India, and if he controls his sexual urge, India, there will be no communal riots. Had one of these 4 or 5 people been around, they would have argued him out of it. They would have scolded him, chastised him. So who did Indira Gandhi have? No one. Right. Modi also has no one. So I think a feedback loop is very important. So it could be in the case of a successful man outside politics, a successful CEO or a general, it could be his wife or his children. But generally, I think that is something where, I think, so it's true. I mean, you start thinking this sense of hubris that overcomes you, where you think you alone are the thing that matters, that, Indira is India and now Modi is India. Yeah, that's very seductive and dangerous.
Honestly, I have no solutions, but I will be interested to see how it develops. Before we go into the closing questions, I have to talk to you about cricket.
Yeah, sure.
Cricket is this one sport that is often dismissed in India because of its popularity as just a silly little game or just people running behind a ball, hitting a ball with stick. And in the book Beyond the Boundary, C.L.R. James asked the question, what do they know of cricket who only cricket know? We spoke earlier about the role of the historian and whether they shape the narrative or they just study it and interpret it. How tightly coupled is cricket with Indian history and the evolution of its culture? Does it just reflect the zeitgeist in the moment, or is it at the helm and actually shapes the narrative?
Well, now it's actually even shaping the narrative. So when I've written several books on cricket, of which the most important is my 2002 book, Corner of a Foreign Field, which examines Indian cricket and its evolution through a sociological and historical lens. And it uses these master categories of race, religion, race, caste, religion, and nation. And now, of course, it's the nation and the market that have taken over. And when I wrote India After Gandhi, India was about to become the most important nation cricketing-wise in terms of reach and financial heft and so on. And of course, then you had IPL. But now, and film and cricket in India After Gandhi, film was seen as more important than cricket. But now cricket is more important than film. I mean, Dhoni commands Dhoni and Kohli and command much higher ad value than Shah Rukh Khan and anyone else, right? So I think, and now of course, Indian team has just won the Women's World Cup, which is great, and it will be built politically by everyone, right? So I think, but for me, I still retain the interest in the love for cricket from an aesthetic lens. I'm not a cricketing jingoist. I don't want India to win all the time. I want a great match. And sometimes it's nicer to watch a match in which India is not playing because the commentators are not, you're not invested and the commentators are not so partisan. But the aesthetics of cricket is what compels you, which is why I particularly like this test cricket. And in fact, I've been thinking yesterday and day before after the Indian team's victory in this World Cup, Indian women's team victory, that what occurred just last week in the semi-final and the final of the Women's World Cup was not just a triumph of India. It was a triumph, or not a triumph, a revalidation of the 50-over game. The 50-over game is actually much more sophisticated than T20. T20 is rubbish. Hard.
It's junk food cricket.
You can build a narrative, you can craft an innings, and bowling changes matter so much more. And of course, Test cricket is even more sophisticated and subtle and creative. So, I mean, the aesthetics of cricket, a batsman beaten in the flight. I still find it hard to say batter, but I should say batter. A batter beaten in the flight. A batter advancing down the wicket and stroking the ball silkily past cover. A bowler airing in length and bowling wide down the leg side, and a fabulous take by the wicketkeeper. A low catch at slip. I mean, these are just thrill me. I mean, the aesthetics of that, which combine artistry and athleticism. This combination of artistry and athleticism, of course, exists in other sports too. I mean, soccer certainly. Tennis has become a power game, so there's not much artistry there. It's just fitness and power, brute power. But for me, cricket remains the most beautiful sport to watch. So, if there's a match on, ideally a test match. If not a test match, a 50-over match. And I don't watch IPL. I tried to watch, but I find it just underwhelming. Another thing I regret less, but I do regret it nonetheless, is that when I was young, I followed every sport. So when I was a student in Delhi, there was a Davis Cup match, I would go and watch it. Yeah, there was an Asian Badminton Championship, I went and watched Prakash Padukone play. Right, if the football match, Mohun Bagan, East Bengal, I was there. Later on, I would watch, the World Cups on television. I would watch Wimbledon. Now I've become, regrettably, a one-sport person. And in that sport, a one-format person. I mean, Test cricket is what I like. But still, the pleasure I get, and I said, it's an aesthetic pleasure. It's a combination of artistry and athleticism that is unfolding before you. And one of the good things about television is how well it can capture all the angles.
You start your book, The Commonwealth of Cricket, with a similar quote about how someone had detached, whoever's quoted was themselves from the nationalist sentiment in cricket.
Yeah.
And just the aesthetic beauty of it and just the moments. I was there at the 2023 World Cup final, and to date, even though it was probably one of the worst days to be an Indian fan, I still cannot rid myself of the feeling of just being there in the moment and watching someone like Pat Cummins perform, which I think was one of the greatest performances I've seen by any captain in a World Cup final. We were talking about the forces of nature shaping history, the Marxist view, and the role of an individual or events. In cricket, more than general history, I just cannot shake the power of serendipity and the butterfly effect of that. Okay, one example is when Gundappa Vishwanath was given not out when he was plumb LBW in the Ranji Trophy semi-final against Bombay. And this is at a period where Bombay was dominating the domestic circuit. And you've said in your book, I cannot deny my partisanship, but I must insist that Karnataka's victory over Bombay in March 1974 was enormously important, not just for me and my side, but for Indian cricket as a whole, for it led to a wholesale decentering of the sport. Bombay had then won the championship 15 times on the trot. In the 15 years that followed, Bombay won the title 3 times, but so did Karnataka. Bishan Singh Bedi's Delhi, now augmented by the Amarnath brothers and Chetan Chauhan, did even better, winning 4 times in this period. Hyderabad and Tamil Nadu won 1 title apiece. This decentering may have happened anyway, but 2 misjudgments hastened it. That which ruled Gundappa Vishwanath not out when he was palpably leg before, and that which led to Ajit Wadekar's run out.
Correct.
In sport,
and all that happened just across the road in the Chinnaswamy Stadium.
That's right.
I mean, really a stone's throw from where we are talking. And I was there. I watched history in the making. Yeah.
Changed the course of Indian history, you could argue. Like in sport, more than in general history, I started to weigh more towards the power of serendipity. You brought up the 83 World Cup and let's even talk about the 2007 World Cup. Both cases, you can't make a case that this is inevitable because both teams are not expected to win at all. A lot of things clicked into place. But the butterfly effect of those victories is the reason why India is dominant in cricket today from the 2007 World Cup because of the IPL and the emergence of franchise cricket. So what do you think? In sport, more than in general history, do you think serendipity, one man, one performance plays a much bigger role than these forces of nature that make it
I
happen?
think, obviously, in among team sports in cricket more than in football. I mean, Bradman changed cricket more than Pele or Maradona or Messi, right? So I think certainly in cricket that is the case. Without Clive Lloyd, the West Indies would not have been welded into or Worrell before him, into a unified, cohesive team.
In Beyond a Boundary, there's a case made for W.G. Grace of how he was not just a good cricketer, but he was representative of England and the social organization at that time.
Victoria in England,
Victor Trumper, similar case. You can make a case for Gavaskar. And
Tendulkar more than Gavaskar. Tendulkar represented, the transformations in India from pre to post liberalization, from, I would say, from patriotism to jingoism, in some ways, unwittingly, very, very striking.
And then Kohli as well. Would he be an embodiment of the zeitgeist?
I think Tendulkar particularly, and I think C.K. Naidu in the earlier phase, and then Gavaskar and Kapil Dev. Kohli just carried on from where, maybe consumer culture and so possibly. I have not thought about that, but it's yes, they do embody the, absolutely. Yeah.
Before we go into the last three closing questions, I would love to know what masterpiece I've built with the Lego. What do you think this is? Kya shapes aapko lagte hai?
Saraj, though I'm married to a graphic designer, I don't have a visual sense at all.
Okay.
So I can't make any intelligent or indeed intelligible comment about it.
Don't even want intelligent comments.
No, all this. This looks like an old transistor radio ad.
That's exactly... Transistor radio. And this?
This I can't say, but this looks like my old transistor radio.
Okay, let's start wrapping up. What are some books, movies, role models that have strongly inspired you? I'm looking for recommendations.
Among the books that have changed my life were Beyond the Boundary, Orwell's Homage to Catalonia, which made me of Marxism. And then more recently, during the pandemic, but I read some of the great 19th century novels for the first time. So Anna Karenina, War and Peace, Middlemarch. I think reading those great novels convinced me that historians should not have an inflated sense of their importance, and great novelists are infinitely more insightful about human life. Movies, I don't watch all that many, but music certainly. So I'd say, again, when one talks about being fortunate, I think to have been able to listen to Ravi Shankar, Ali Akbar, Vilayat, Bismillah, Kishori Amonkar, Mallikarjun Mansoor, Kumar Gandharv, Bhimsen Joshi, Nikhil Banerjee, all live, N. Rajam, who's my favorite living instrumentalist, who plays the violin. Wonderful. She's actually quite extraordinary. I think that is something, and now, of course, with YouTube, to have all the riches of the past on YouTube. So, yes, music very much. But movies, among the recent movies I saw, I'm not a great movie buff. Among the recent movies I saw which left a deep impression on me was Satyajit Ray's Jal Sagar, which also has great music in it. So it's a kind of a decaying feudal family.
You said, when I lived in Delhi in the 1990s, I wished I had the time to walk on Rajpath every day, from the 1st of January to the 31st of December, chronicling the appearance and disappearance of the tents and their residents. That would be the story of India, as told from a single street and in a single year. I'm going to change this slightly and apply to your life personally. What would be the Rajpath equivalent of your life? What would be the story of Ramachandra Guha? If you had to summarize one statement, one blurb for your legacy.
My story is profoundly uninteresting.
I doubt it.
It is profoundly uninteresting. I have been married to the same woman for 40 years. I have never had an affair, and she's never had an affair.
These are not the only things that make people interesting.
I've never indulged in property disputes, in fist fights. I have a profoundly uninteresting life.
Have been arrested though? Have been arrested?
No, for a few hours. Other people have spent years and years in jail.
This is not a competition of getting interesting.
Merely because they belong to the wrong religion, they spend years and years in jail. I'd say what is interesting about my life is that not interesting, slightly different from my life, from most people of my class background, is that I have had the opportunity to live in many different parts of India and many different kinds of Indians. So, what happens generally among the urban upper middle class to which I belong is your social world is shaped by what profession you are. If you're an entrepreneur, you hang around with entrepreneurs, lawyer with other lawyers, doctor with other doctors. I have friends across the spectrum. And also friends not merely from my elite background, but from more, shall we say, rural, provincial, cosmopolitan backgrounds. I've had the opportunity to travel every part of India. Although I don't know any other language, Indian language or Hindi, I know the states of Kerala, Maharashtra, Gujarat, Orissa, Bihar, not Bihar, Uttar Pradesh, Uttarakhand quite well. And I have in each of the, and several other states too, in each of these states, Assam, each of these states I have close friends who are among the leading intellectuals of that state, who can introduce me to the beauty and the diversity of Gujarati culture, Odia culture, or Assamese culture, or Tamil culture. So I think that is something. I've led a life which had led to all kinds of very different kinds of encounters across social, professional, geographical, religious backgrounds, which I think is not so common in India, where you tend to live and befriend your own kinds of people.
How do you want me to remember? What would you like your legacy to be?
Nothing. I don't think about it. As I said, you see, if you spent your life writing about Gandhi and Ambedkar and Tagore, you know how insignificant your own life is. You're just a narrator and a documenter. You've had the privilege of writing about remarkable people, not just these famous people. Now, for example, I'm writing a book about, may take a few years to publish. My next book, as I said, is about Gandhi and his critics. But I'm writing a book about two remarkable reformers. One Hindu, one Muslim, who tried to rid their religion of its most disfiguring elements. Caste and gender equality, to cultivate a open-minded, less bigoted, more modernist attitude among their fellow Muslims or their fellow Hindus. So these are two individuals who are not remotely as celebrated as Gandhi and Ambedkar, but whose life struggle was actually as fascinating, and whose moral commitment and courage was, of a similar order. So I think when you've worked on such people, then you don't take yourself, you don't give yourself much importance. You're just fortunate to be able to chronicle the lives of all these other people. All the remarkable.
Underselling your contribution.
No. I don't understand. I know what I've done, what I've not done. But I think so the only state I have not been to is Nagaland. And I was going to go there when the pandemic broke out. So my trip was booked. I was flying to Guwahati, driving to Kaziranga, where a friend of mine runs a wonderful kind of, low intensity resort. Then I was going to drive to Dimapur, and then the pandemic happened. So I still hope to go. But I've been to every other state, so I have memories of Manipur, Arunachal, apart from all, Kashmir, Jammu. And I think that's given me a sense of the diversity, the extraordinary diversity of our country, and why a single template, a single uniform kind of rule book of what it takes to be an Indian can never apply.
Okay. I still maintain your underselling your contribution, your books, essays, and also the work you're doing with the New India Foundation. I think they're all a good legacy and a great impact that you've had. Also want to ask you about India. In the first edition of India After Gandhi, when you were confronted with the question of whether India is a democracy, you had borrowed a line from Johnny Walker, and he said 50-50. In a later edition, you brought it down to 30-70. Very good.
Yes.
Now I need a latest status update from you. What's the status of India? Is it 30-70 better, improved?
It's about 30-70, 25-75, 30.
Oh, getting worse.
Maybe getting slightly worse. From that point of view.
Okay, very comforting. Okay, hopefully it improves over time. Final question, and I've saved the easiest question for the end. What is the meaning of life, Ramachandra Guha?
Unlike some of my relatives, including my wife, I don't think very much about it. I think you come into this world, and now, of course, you acquire certain obligations and responsibilities beyond your professional work. And you must continuously interrogate yourself, including your weaknesses, your deficiencies, because I'm human, which means I'm prone to the human traits of envy, jealousy, selfishness, weakness. And once you know all of this and so one of the things I know, this may sound slightly preachy, but I believe I'm being truthful and honest here, is I know that in the course of my life, I have not been a perfect parent or a perfect child. I've been a rather imperfect and erratic and sometimes uncaring parent and child. And but I can see that there are ways in which I can make amends. My mother is now 97. Well, maybe for the last 2 or 3 years, I have been more caring, more giving. Maybe like my children who are now in their 30s, I was too obsessed with my own work. I was a little neglectful. I was not mean to them, but so I think this ability to constantly self-examine yourself, to be a better historian, of course, to be a more lucid and clear writer, but also to be a less flawed human being. I mean, the struggle, there's no struggle for perfection, but there is a continuous struggle to be less imperfect, both in your professional life and in your personal life. And I think if you can be aware of that and know that it'll just be a struggle to be less imperfect, that's how I would put it professionally and personally. In both what you do in public and both how you conduct yourself in private. I think that is something which strikes me more and more the older I get.
Struggle to be less imperfect. I think that can be a good meaning. Sir, if people wish to connect with you, read your books, read your essays, what is the best way to find you, connect with you, read your work?
So, my email is in the public domain. People write to me. I usually reply. I always reply, not always at length, because if it's an abusive mail, but often I learn from people, I interact with people. Of course, they can read my books. They can read my book recommendations. So, for example, when on the 70th anniversary of our independence, I compiled a list of 50 great books on independent India. And the 50 books spanned genres. So there was biography, history, sociology, travelogue, policy works. And likewise, Makers of Modern India ends with a very long reading list. So I like recommending books to read. I often now in my columns, I often write about books, rather than about issues. So you'll get a sense of what kinds of works of virtually history, biography, politics, non-fiction, I found stimulating in my own writings. The advice I give to young writers, again, one thing and young readers, is try and read outside your comfort zone. If you're inclined towards the left, read intelligent right-wing commentary, and vice versa. If you're a Hindu, try to read more about Muslims. If you're a Brahmin, try to read more about people from subordinate castes, and so on. If you're a man, try and understand the world of women. So I think that to understand people different from you, read about them. So I think that is, rather than be, trapped in your own circle, which social media encourages. You're the same kind of confirmation bias, the same kinds of people you're interacting with. That I think, so I wish there was a really good right-wing magazine in India, which doesn't exist. When I travel to England, I read The Spectator, which is lively and clever and contrarian and challenges my biases rather than confirms them. So I think that's, I would say read widely. And likewise with music. I mean, I listen to classical music, but my children listen to different kinds of music. And whenever I go to their homes, the music playing is always new and enriching and to me. So yes, I think the diversity of human experience, rather than being trapped in a particular viewpoint, a particular ideology, a particular set of beliefs, I think just as strive to be less imperfect, strive to be less certain and less dogmatic, in how you view the world.
I think that's good advice and symbolic of this conversation, sir. Thank you so much for your time. This has been an honor and a privilege.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This is no time. If you like what you just watched or listened to, then do consider subscribing on YouTube, following on Spotify, or rate 5 stars in Apple Podcasts. This is now my full-time job for a year. And if I can't get this project up and running, I can't pay the bills with this project, then I'll have to shut shop because unfortunately, I'm not a trust fund baby. I cannot support this lifestyle. So if you think this project has value and deserves to continue, then please consider becoming a member on Patreon. You can join as a YouTube member. You can buy super thanks. You can buy gifts on Instagram Reels. Any contribution will keep this project running. If not through monetary channels, and do consider sharing these episodes, leaving your likes and comments. They all go a really long way. Shows of this nature are not algorithm friendly. It's not considered sexy content. It's not likely to go viral. But I really believe in the power of these stories that are never told, these conversations that are not had because they're not less likely to go viral. So if you really think these conversations are of value, these stories deserve to be told, then please consider sharing these episodes. It really helps push these videos past the barriers that are set by the algorithm and also past all this AI junk that's coming on YouTube these days. For other forms of love and support, you can follow this channel on Instagram or Twitter, or follow me personally.